Good to go, Councillor.
Good evening and welcome to Crawley Borough Council's Governance Committee meeting of 26th of January 2021. Welcome to members of the press and the public watching this meeting live. I am Councillor Richard Barrett, Chair of the Governance Committee. This is a meeting being held in public and not a public meeting. There will be no public question time at any council meeting while virtual committee meetings are being held. The public and press can still hear and see the meeting, but public speaking has been suspended and any written questions submitted in advance that were deemed acceptable by the council's monitoring officer will be read out and answered. There will be no supplementary questions. The agenda for this meeting is published and available on the council's website. For any committee meeting held virtually, all voting will be held via a recorded vote taken by a Democratic Services team member on behalf of the chair, whereby individual councillors will be asked at the end of the debate to state if they are for, against, or if they wish to abstain on the recommendation before them at that time. The exceptions to this are the approval of the minutes from the previous meeting or any other procedural item, or where the item's sole recommendation to the committee is to note the report. For those items, the chair will move the item, seconded by the vice chair, and it will be presumed agreed unless a dissenting comment from any committee member is made. May I ask the Democratic Services Officer producing this meeting to introduce herself?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Mez Matthews. I'm the Democratic Services Officer. Chris Pedlow, Democratic Services Manager, and Jess Tamplin, the Democratic Services Support Officer, are also supporting this meeting.
Thank you. Before I invite members of the committee to confirm their attendance, I ask that they please ensure that their mobile phones are switched off or on silent, their backgrounds are set to a generic office background, and they are aware of their surroundings so they are not disturbed during the meeting. This includes making sure all TVs, radios and smart speakers are switched off. Committee members are reminded that they should have their microphones switched off unless speaking, and their cameras turned off unless they're requesting to speak. When asked to speak, please turn your camera on, unmute yourselves and pause for 3 seconds to allow for the slight time delay in connection. With this in mind, committee members are asked to be aware of who they will follow in the voting process and to prepare accordingly. If we now move on to the agenda, item 1, apologies for absence. Have we received any apologies for absence?
We have not, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Items 2 and 3, disclosure of interest and minutes. We will now be taking committee member introductions together with items 2 and 3. Please may I ask committee members, when called upon, to confirm their name and the ward they represent, if they have any declarations of interest to make, and if they agree the minutes of the meeting of the Governance Committee held on 17th of November 2020.
Okay, Councillor Barrett.
I'm Councillor Richard Barrett, Councillor for Pound Hill North and Forge Wood Ward, and Chair of the Governance Committee. I have no declarations of interest to make, and I agree with the minutes of the last meeting.
Thank you, Councillor Crowe.
Good evening. I'm Duncan Crowe, the Councillor for Furness Green. I have no declarations of interest to declare, and I approve the minutes of the previous meeting.
Councillor Eade. Just unmute yourself, Councillor Eade.
Can you hear me?
That's good.
You can. Oh, sorry about that. I'm Councillor Reid. I'm Councillor for the Furness Green Ward. I agree the minutes of the last meeting and I have no declarations of interest.
Thank you, Councillor Jones. Could you please turn your camera on?
Hello there, I'm Councillor Michael Jones. I represent Bewbush and Broadfield North Ward. I have no declarations of interest to make and I agree the minutes of the last meeting.
Thank you. Councillor Lamb.
Councillor Peter Lamb, I am the member for Northgate and West Green. I have no declarations of interest and I agree the minutes of the last meeting.
Councillor Lanza.
Good evening. I'm Councillor Bob Lands, a member for Pound Hill South and Worth. I have no declarations of interest and I agree the minutes of the last meeting. Thank you.
Councillor Lunnan. If you just unmute your microphone, please, Councillor Lunnan.
There we go. Sorry, apologies. My name's Tim Lunnan. I'm the councillor for Broadfield Ward and I approved the minutes of the previous meeting and I have no declarations of interest.
Councillor Malik.
Good evening. Councillor Shahzad Malik from Langley Green and Tushmore Ward. I have no declaration to make and I agree with the minutes of the last meeting. Thank you.
Councillor McCarthy.
Hi, good evening. I'm Councillor Kevin McCarthy, representing Pound Hill North and Forge Wood. I have no declarations of interest and I approve the minutes from the last governance meeting held on the 17th of November. Thank you.
Councillor Mullins.
Yeah, I'm Councillor Chris Mullins for Gossip's Green and Broadfield North East. I've nothing to declare, no interests, and I agree the minutes of the last meeting.
Thank you. And for record purposes, we have Natalie Brahma Pearl, Chief Executive of the Council, and Andrew Oakley, Electoral Services Manager, who are also present in this meeting.
Thank you. The committee has agreed that the minutes of the meeting of the Governance Committee held on 17th of November 2020 are an accurate record of the meeting, and I will sign those shortly. We then move on to item 4, public question time. Have there been any written questions submitted that were accepted under the Constitution and subsequently published in a supplementary agenda?
We received no public questions, Chair.
Okay, thank you. That then takes us on to our first substantive item. Item 5, final report of the Independent Remuneration Panel on Councillors' Allowances Scheme 2021 to 22 and 2022 to 23. We will now move on to consideration of that report. Can I ask Jess Tamplin, Democratic Services Support Officer, to please present the report to the committee?
Good evening. So, agenda item 5, final report of the Independent Remuneration Panel, is threefold. Report LDS 163 gives an overview of the final report of the Independent Remuneration Panel. Appendix A is the final report of the panel itself. And Appendix B is the proposed Councillors' Allowances Scheme for 2021-22 and 2022-23. At this point, please note that page 21 of the original agenda, which is the table of allowance rates, included incorrect information. So this has been replaced by the page published as a supplementary agenda. So please refer to this in place of the table on page 21. Report LDS 163 requests that the Governance Committee considers the final report of the IRP and its recommendations and decides on the allowance rates it wishes to recommend to the full Council. As some background information to this report, there is a legal requirement for the Council to appoint an IRP to consider the amount of allowances paid to councillors and for the Council to have regard to these recommendations. This is detailed under the Local Authorities Members Allowances England Regulations 2003. The last review of the Councillors' Allowances Scheme by an IRP was in 2016. However, more recently, councillors will remember that in 2020, report LDS 156 to the Governance Committee delegated the appointment of individuals to the IRP to the head of Legal, Democracy and HR in conjunction with the Chair and Vice Chair of the Governance Committee. 4 individuals following this from local businesses and community organisations were appointed. Details of the appointees can be found in section 2.1 of Appendix A. So the IRP began consideration of the allowances in October after some delays which were caused by the coronavirus pandemic. The deliberations were based on the regulations, which required the panel to make recommendations on various forms of councillors' allowance, which are set out in section 2.2 of Appendix A. A summary of each of the 3 meetings can be found in section 3 of Appendix A. A wide range of information was considered by the members of the IRP, who gave thoughtful consideration from an independent viewpoint. Information considered included, but was not limited to, the following: the council's decision-making processes and the responsibilities of councillors, allowances schemes of other local authorities, including recent recommendations by other IRPs, councillors' responses to a feedback form which was created by the IRP. This was regarding current workloads and responsibilities, the various effects of the coronavirus pandemic, including the financial position of the council and the change in nature of councillors' duties, the provision of ICT equipment to councillors, and the allowance package and facilities provided to the mayor, information about the Crawley mayor's duties and also of other councils' mayoral allowances. It should be noted that mayoral allowances are not covered by the legislation, but previous IRPs had deemed it good practice to include these in the reviews as they were happening. So after consideration of this information over several meetings, the IRP formed its recommendations, which can be found in full in section 4 of Appendix A. So a brief summary of recommendations A to H is as follows. It was agreed that fixing allowances in the current unusual circumstances it was agreed that fixing allowances for 4 years in the current unusual circumstances would be unrepresentative in these years to come. So the recommendations apply to an allowances scheme that will be in place for the next 2 financial years. The basic allowance and all special responsibility allowances should remain the same and should not increase with the Chief Officer's Pay Award Index as they previously have done. And as a general summary, all other rates do remain the same, but these are laid out in full, as I say, in section 4 of Appendix A. Recommendations I and J regard the mayoral allowances. So the IRP recommends a reduction in the mayor's allowance, the amount of which should be decided by the Governance Committee and in turn the full council. The IRP members agreed to provide an independent steer on the rate of allowance to the mayor, but that councillors were best placed for agreeing the exact financial amount due to their experience and their knowledge of the role. It was noted that if the allowance were to remain the same, the panel advised that a clear rationale should be provided for doing so instead. In light of this, the IRP also recommended that the Deputy Mayor's allowance should be maintained at the current rate unless a substantial change is made to the Mayor's allowance, in which case the rate should be altered to remain at the same proportion as it is at now, which is approximately 15% of the Mayor's allowance, which reflects the workload. So the Governance Committee is therefore asked to consider the final report of the IRP and its recommendations and to decide on the allowance rates it wishes to recommend to the full council. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll now open up the debate. Given that I think this report falls into 2 very distinct halves, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to hold 2 separate debates and votes on the item. The first debate and vote will be in relation to recommendations A to H of the IRP report, i.e. the basic and special responsibility allowances. And once we've done that, we'll then move on and hold a separate debate and vote on the allowances for the mayor and deputy mayor. I think that's going to be the simplest way to do it under the circumstances. Can I then ask, we'll start the debate on recommendations A to H. Please turn your camera on if you wish to speak, and you'll be brought in on the discussion for the general allowances. Please unmute your microphone and check that you are live before pausing for 3 seconds to allow for the time. Councillor Mullins.
Thank you. I think I just wanted to say, first of all, thanks to both the officers and the members of the Independent Remuneration Panel for their work on this. Obviously, I've seen it happen before and it usually goes through quite smoothly. I think the recommendations, considering everything that's going on, you know, the councillors obviously in financially tougher times than before, and at the same time, councillors are sort of having to deal with how they react to that in different ways. So I think the proposal they've come up with to keep everything as it is and not to increase it is perfectly reasonable, and I'll be fully supporting it. And I encourage all other members to as well. You know, the whole point of an independent remuneration panel is that they take the vested interest element out of it and provide a neutral review of what we're given. And they've come up with this recommendation, so I think it'd be very unwise for anybody to suggest anything otherwise. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Councillor Lunn. Can I say you know, I totally concur with your comments on that. I now have Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's oddly sort of self-serving, really, to be voting on our own allowances, but that's the whole reason why we employ the work of an independent review body, you know, so that we don't vote on our own pay rises or whatever. So I think absolutely we've handed control to them. I think we should trust the decisions that they make, and we should support them. I don't see any reason why not to support items A to H on the list. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not seeing any other councillors indicating. Chris Pedlow has his camera on. Chris, did you want to make a comment? No. Okay. And I don't think there's anything there really that needs an officer response, given that the two comments we've had are simply supporting the recommendations. As there are no further speakers, we will move on to the vote on recommendations A to H as set out in the IRP report, which I propose to take a single vote on. Can I just ask, please indicate now if anyone is not in agreement with us having a single vote on all those recommendations together by turning your camera on. No? No dissent has been indicated, so I will proceed with the vote. We will be taking a recorded vote. I move recommendations A to H, and that these be put forward to the full council. And in doing so, I would also like to add my personal thanks to the members of the Independent Review Panel and the officers who supported them for the excellent work that they've done on this. Please note that I'm doing this to move the recommendations to the vote, and it does not necessarily indicate my support nor that of the Vice Chair for the recommendations themselves, although obviously on this occasion both the Vice Chair and I have already said what we think, so you can deduce that for yourselves. Can I ask the Vice Chair to please second the recommendation?
Seconded, thank you.
Thank you. And can I ask the Democratic Services Manager to conduct the recorded vote?
Thank you, Chair. For clarity's sake, the recommendations that the committee is about to vote on are recommendations A to H by the Remuneration Panel, and this is for them to be sent forward to full council for ratification. So, Councillor Burrows, please announce your vote.
4.
Councillor Crowe?
4.
Councillor Eade?
4.
Councillor Jones?
4.
Councillor Lamb?
4.
Councillor Lanza?
4.
Councillor Lunn?
4.
Councillor Malik,
4,
Councillor McCarthy,
4,
and finally Councillor Mullins.
4.
Chair, to confirm that was a unanimous vote in favour of recommendations A to H to be agreed and to be sent forward to the full council for their ratification.
Thank you. Recommendations A to H of the Independent Remuneration Panel final report have been approved. We will now discuss recommendations I and J of the Independent Remuneration Panel. Recommendation I of the panel is: if a clear rationale cannot be provided for maintaining the rate of allowance payable to the Mayor, the allowance should be reduced by an amount to be decided by the Governance Committee and in turn the full Council. The IRP advises that careful consideration be given to what it deemed was a disproportionately high allowance compared to mayoral allowances of other local authorities. Recommendation J is the Deputy Mayor's allowance should be maintained at the current rate unless a substantial change is made to the Mayor's allowance, in which case the rate should be altered proportionately to remain at approximately 15% of the Mayor's allowance. I now open the debate to the floor. Please turn your camera on if you wish to speak. But before I bring anyone else in, I would just like to make a comment myself, which is that part of the reason we have split this out for discussion is that clearly this is the item that's likely to cause some discussion and some controversy. I have to say that personally, I have no problem with reducing the mayoral allowance if that's what the independent panel felt was appropriate. What doesn't sit comfortably with me is their request that the Governance Committee and in turn the full Council should decide the amount of that allowance. Councillor McCarthy made the comment earlier that actually the whole point of having an independent panel is that they make those recommendations, not us. And I personally feel that it's inappropriate for us as council to be pulling a figure out of the air and making that proposal. And therefore, I would rather we sent this particular recommendation back to the independent review panel to say that we're happy with the principle of a reduction, but we really feel it should be up to them to make a decision on or make a recommendation on the amount. I've got Councillor Lamb indicating to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would say much the same. I wouldn't say that we're fine in principle reviewing it or lowering it rather. I'd say we're entirely open to whatever they decide, but they do need to decide it. It's not for us to be determining what paid. There's clearly a conflict of interest there, and any member could in theory become mayor next year.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Crowe.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I'd certainly support the comments of Councillor Lamb and those of yourself. I take the view that we should be consistent here and that the panel should be the ones who are deciding on this. But what I would say is that members, as indeed they can and do sometimes when looking at the rest of the allowance scheme, members can indeed and ought to make some representation to the panel when they are looking at this. But ultimately, it is for the panel to make that recommendation. I'd feel much more comfortable with that. So happy to support what Councillor Lamb and yourself have said.
Okay, thank you. I've got Councillor Mullins next.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I mean, clearly there should have been a stronger recommendation from the panel. I mean, that's obvious. I wonder if they, in doing this, they talked to past mayors because the past mayors can tell. This has been an unusual year, and I think the present mayor probably hasn't had to do as much as mayors normally do for this current year. It's very different. But somebody who's been a mayor, I know how much work it is, and it's an awful lot of work. I mean, by the time I got to the end of my year, I was really quite tired. And it's a lovely commitment. It's a nice thing to do, and you meet right across the town. It's actually for a year the portfolio that's very, very busy, and it's day and night. I mean, 7 days a week. So I mean, I just find it a little hard to say that the allowance is too much for that job when I know the job and I've done it. and that's why I would be a little bit reticent. I mean, I do think that panel should have probably made a stronger decision, but I think that we can't let it go without some comment about the duties of the mayor, or ask them, in fact, to talk to past mayors to get some feeling for what the duty requires in the town. Because in normal times, you know, when we're not suffering from this COVID, it's a very, very busy activity, and you're going day and night. And when you put it into context, it's not very much money per hour, if you like, in terms. It's not, and it's a very, very busy job. So I mean, I just think that if we send it back, which I'm not against, I think it needs to have some qualification with it about what we would like them to look at and take into consideration. I think that would be fair to future mayors, much fairer than just cutting it.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I bring any other members in, I've got Chris Pedlow, Democratic Services Manager, who wants to make a comment.
Thank you, Chair. I just thought I'd provide some context on behalf of the remuneration panel. Members were, and in answer to Councillor Mullins' question, members and former mayors were asked to provide some feedback to the panel over the allowance, especially regarding the mayor, and the majority felt it was actually about right for the work the mayor does. The big issue the panel had was twofold. Was firstly, obviously, the COVID times. They were looking at the schedule of events and other aspects that the current mayor did, and compared that to partly to the previous mayor's year, which again was affected by COVID. So they didn't feel it was a fair reflection on the mayoral allowance that the number of events that they did during that period. The other factor they were quite keen on to look at was the whole package of the mayoralty, in terms of it's not just their allowance, it's they get they're supported by the chauffeur, and they get the mayoral car. That's what they were slightly concerned at, the wider whole package when they were considering it. They did actually compare the council's mayoral allowances to other councils in the vicinity, and that's where their findings of feeling was quite on the high side, but they understood the value that this council value the council rates for the mayor. So they wanted members to have that say, because they didn't think just from a statistical nature they could put a figure on on Crawley's mayoral allowance. There's one other point I'd like to bring up is the mayor's package is certainly to do with transport. It's likely to be changing in the not too distant future with regards to the potentially the mayor's car and the chauffeurs and how that works. So we are, from an office level, we are looking at that as part of the wider remit. So I just thought I'd give some context to the panel's views, and they were quite strong in sending it back because they didn't think they had the context. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I've got Councillor Mccarthy next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I would say that whilst I agree with a lot of what Chris Mullins said, I would also say that the landscape for the mayoralty is changing. The going out meet and greet obviously hasn't been possible this year, but ultimately there's a lot more social media now, and there's a lot more online work that goes on behind the scenes. And for all, you know, our current mayor is an absolute monster online. He's that's what he does, you know, and you think, like, if he was paid by the hour, he'd be well less than minimum wage, you know. So it has changed a bit. I think we've got to look at what the role entails and what the role's likely to entail. I don't really want to make a decision based on a coronavirus year where things are different, because next year when things maybe are back to normal, or this year when things are back to normal, then we could end up with a scheme that's no longer fair. Okay, that's my say on that. Thank you very much. Like I said, as I mentioned before, put it back to the IRP and let them come up with some figures. Thank you.
Okay, Are there any other members who wish to speak? Councillor Mullins, do you want to come back?
Yeah, sorry about coming back, Richard. I don't normally do that if I can help it. But we were told that the towns in the vicinity were used as a comparison. And I just sat here thinking you can't use the towns in the locality as a comparison because they're nothing like Crawley. They don't have an international airport. They don't have the major industrial estate that we've got. They don't have the type of housing that we got. And I take what Kevin says about some work being done online, but most of it is going to see people. When you go to a school with your chain on, the children want to crowd around you and admire you, and it makes you feel good, quite honestly. But it's a very interactive activity, and I don't think it compares to Haywards Heath or Horsham, which don't have the same sort of levels of activity for their mayor. Our mayor is a very busy mayor, non-stop all year, and I just think that needs emphasising. I mean, I do accept that somebody's got to do something, and as Kevin said, you cannot compare COVID years to the normal activities of the mayor because the mayor has been shut off from those normal activities. Pray God that won't always be the case and we get over this awful disease and we get back to normal. And when we do, the job will return by and large to normal because visits are what are demanded of the job. You can't do it on the internet, really. You've got to be there and you've got to make a speech and address the audience, whether it's a business in Manor Royal or it's a welcome at the airport to some new airline that's come in that I did. And things like that. So you can be anywhere doing this work, and it's quite a commitment. So, I mean, but we can't compare now in the COVID situation to what the job's like. It just doesn't work.
Thank you. Again, before I come to the next member who wants to speak, Chris Pedlow wants to come in.
Thank you, Chair. Just to in response to what Councillor Mullins said, I think the reason the panel felt they couldn't actually put a figure on the Crawley mayoral allowance is actually exactly what Councillor Mullins has just stated. They understood how important we find the mayor as a council and the number of events. So they didn't think they could judge it purely on a financial basis in comparison. So that's why they were trying to felt they couldn't put that. Put a figure on it, and they felt members are actually in a better understanding of what we require from the mayor than themselves. And should, based on what you've been saying, should you wish to send it back to them, I would be doubtful we would get a response or a report back to governance until the new municipal year. Just for information. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bob Lanza.
Thank you, Chair. Like everyone else, I thank the Independent Remuneration Panel. And I've encountered several independent remuneration panels over the years, both here and West Sussex, and for the most part, they have felt able to conduct sufficient analysis to make a recommendation on the allowances, the whole range of allowances. I found the comparisons offered just now by Councillor Mullins to be strange, because I wouldn't expect us to make a comparison with Haywards Heath Town Council. Clearly, it's a very great difference of scale. I wouldn't expect to make a comparison with Horsham District because it doesn't have a mayor anyway. I suppose, and I don't want to overly steer the panel, but you would make a comparison with places like Worthing Borough. Again, we shouldn't wish to steer the panel to excess. However, I think that their broad conclusion, based on comparison with statistical neighbours, is that our allowance is a shade too high, and I'd be reluctant to attempt to overturn that view, as I would with any independent panel recommendation. So I think, based on historical performances of independent review panels and the desire not to overturn, we should refer it back, and if necessary, our Democratic Services team, I would suggest, give some guidance on statistical comparisons that they could make, which would help inform their decision.
Okay, thank you very much. Chris Pedlow.
We can happily share. I mean, based on the feedback from the committee, I can clearly see, understand your steer, but I can quite happily show you, if you should so wish, to the comparison we did in terms against the other boroughs who have mayors rather than chairmen, such as Horsham. If the committee wants it, but I can tell based on your feedback or views, I think it'll be going back to the panel. So it's there if the committee wishes it to be shown.
Thank you. I mean, in terms of the panel, there, as you say, there is benchmarking available. There's also the South East Employers Annual Survey, which provides that sort of information, and hopefully the panel would be able to use that to perhaps recommend a figure. I've got Jess Tamplin now.
Thank you, Chair. Just wanted to add for the record and for councillors' information that South East Employers 2019 survey of the mayors and the deputy mayors' allowances was provided to the panel for their considerations, just for the record.
Okay, thank you very much. If there are no further speakers, we need to move to a vote on these recommendations. Can I ask if any member would like to put forward a proposal, an amendment along the lines of what's been discussed? Councillor Lanza.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I move an amendment that we refer back to the panel the position regarding those two recommendations, Mayor and Deputy Mayor, and invite them to make a recommendation as to the allowances for both positions.
Thank you. Is that seconded?
Chair, can I add something?
Yeah, well, go ahead, Councillor Mullins.
Thank you. I mean, I just don't think it should be sent back just like that. I think I'm quite happy for it to go back, but I think we ought to ask them to look at the detail of Crawley Town and how that compares, because I accept that there's no mayors, and it did say vicinity, so I assume that they were looking at local towns. But I mean, if you go down to Worthing is a very, very different town to Crawley. So when you start to go into West Sussex and look at the mayors, there's no comparison to Crawley at all anywhere. So, you know, I think you'd have to sort of go the other way and look at Croydon or something like that to get a better comparison for the sort of activities that probably go on to Crawley. And that I would ask them, if it's part of that amendment, that Bob, just that we fill it out a little bit with some of our thoughts about what Crawley's like in comparison, and that in West Sussex there isn't another single town that's anything like Crawley.
Well, thank you. Can I just say, just as an aside, in commenting on that, my understanding from the comparisons that were done and the figures that were found is that actually the highest mayoral allowance in the South East is actually Reigate and Banstead Borough Council, which of course is one of our neighbours, which I thought was quite interesting. I've got Councillor Crowe now. And you're on mute, Councillor Crowe.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, thank you, Chairman. I don't agree with Councillor Mullins that we should be adding a whole load of commentary when we're passing it back, because we would effectively be passing it back with conditions. As I said in my speech earlier, I would encourage any member of the council who has a view on this to submit their views to the panel while they're looking at it, and they will look at it and weigh it up against all the evidence. I don't think that this committee should be stating its view as to what might influence the level of the mayoral allowances. I have no view on what they should be. Let's see what the panel come up with. So I wouldn't support Councillor Mullins, but you know, if nobody else seconds, I will. But I'll see if anybody else wishes to second Councillor Lanza's proposal. But just to say that I don't think we should be altering it. I suppose someone could do an amendment to Councillor Lanza's proposal, but I really wouldn't support it. I think it starts getting too complicated, and we're starting to meddle about with it just a little bit too much. You know, the case for what that allowance should be and what the role of the mayor should be made in the representations from individual members to be weighed up by the panel.
Right, thank you. Well, where do we go from here then? Councillor Lanza has moved a proposal. Can I ask if someone other than Councillor Crowe wishes to second that?
I'll second it, Richard.
That's seconded by Councillor Eade. Did you want to say anything else, Councillor Eade? You turned your camera on first, or was it simply to second?
I was just second it, and I do admit during normal years the mayoral position is very, very busy.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Lamb, were you indicating?
No, I was just going to second if no one else was.
Okay. Chris?
Just based on Councillor Lanz's thank you. So just based on Councillor Lamb's amendment and seconded by Councillor Eade, can I just clarify? Are you therefore recommending that that decision goes back to the panel and that the current rate will continue until further notice? Because otherwise we just need that for clarity to say when it goes to full the decision goes to full council. I presume you are, but I didn't want to. I think it would have.
I think it would have to. Councillor Lanza.
Yeah, that would of course be my intention, because otherwise we'd be doing what we said we didn't want to do, which is to make an alternative decision, wouldn't we? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Thank you. Right, before we move to the vote, are there any other speakers? Or are there any alternative proposals? Okay, in that case, we will now vote on the proposals that have just been moved and seconded. Proposed by Councillor Lanza, seconded by Councillor Eade. Would the Democratic Services Manager please conduct the recorded vote?
Excuse me. We're voting on the amendment moved, or the views moved by Councillor Lanza, seconded by Councillor Eade, that the Governance Committee sends back the proposals back to the IOP, so they revisit it and decides on a new rate for the Mayor and Deputy Mayor's allowance to be brought back to the Governance Committee at the most appropriate time. Councillor Burrow, can you provide your view decision, please?
I'll vote for the proposal.
Councillor Crowe?
For.
Councillor Eade?
For.
Councillor Jones?
For.
Councillor Lamb?
For.
Councillor Lanza?
For.
Councillor Lunnan?
For.
Councillor Malik?
For.
Councillor McCarthy?
For. Thank you.
And finally, Councillor Mullins?
Against.
Chair, the proposal by Councillor Lanza of the amendment is carried by 9 to 1. That the decision be sent back to the be sent back to the IOP panel for them to provide us a steer and a very clear view of the new rating, and that the current allowance continue and that be sent to full council. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So the committee has approved the proposal to refer this back to the independent panel and to leave the mayoral and deputy mayoral allowances as they currently stand, pending a further recommendation from the IRP. So thank you all very much for that report and discussion. If we now move on to item 6 on the agenda, allocation of the report on the allocation of committee chairs and vice chairs. Can I ask Chris Pedlow, Democratic Services Manager, to please present the report to the committee?
Thank you, Chair. The Leader of the Council and the Leader of the Opposition signed a joint group agreement to assist with the council's move to no overall control in July last year. Part of that agreement was that work be undertaken to research options regarding the possibility of a more proportional system for appointing committee chairs and vice chairs. It was felt that this was an opportunity to adapt the protocol which would be more sustainable regardless of which party was in administration, and which could be in place before the upcoming elections with a cross-party agreement. In producing this report, there was a clear direction for me, not to provide a steer, but just to solely come up with some options for the governance committee to consider and adapt, or provide their own views to. The options set out in section 6 of the report were simply indicative approach, and there was no steer contained within them. The recommendations before you, excuse me, is to consider the options put forward and to decide which views, if any, should go to full council for adoption, and so that the constitution be adopted accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll now open up the debate. Please turn your camera on if you wish to speak and you'll be brought in. And the first person indicating is Councillor Crowe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Firstly, I thank the Democratic Services Manager for producing this report and for providing two illustrative approaches that could be used. I do think it would be very helpful to have an agreed approach for future years, apart from a very notable exception of this year's annual council meeting. Annual council meetings in the past have been very much dominated by arguing over this, that and the other, quite frankly, when it comes to positions, and it has actually sort of, in my view, held up what is actually meant to be quite notable for the closing down of one mayoral year and the start of a new mayoral year with a new mayor and everything that would normally entail. And we could have very much simpler annual council meetings, and we could remove all the arguments if we had a scheme in place. Now, Democratic Services Manager has put forward two illustrative examples. One is a fixed cascade approach, and the other is a strict proportional approach. And I do have a preference on this, which is the fixed cascade approach. My issue with the strict proportional approach is, while it could be argued that it is the most fair option in terms of committee chairs and vice chairs, its downfall is that is all that it's looking at, and it's not taking into account everything else at the council. So, for example, let's say we've got a party with 19 seats that obviously has a majority of 2 on the council, and that party would have 6 or 7 cabinet posts, plus presumably, though it's not a given, the mayoralty, that's the mayor and the deputy mayor, and then they would also be looking at half of the council seats, and half of the committee chairs and half of the vice chairs. And actually that would also apply if it was a hung council with 18-18, in that the group that had the mayoralty would have, well, it wouldn't be a majority of the council, it would be a sort of working majority, even though you had 2 groups in 18, but they would still have half the committee chairs and vice chairs, although it would create a difficulty given that we're talking about 5 committees, and obviously you couldn't just have one split down the middle as to whether it's a chair or vice chair. So with the issues that I have with the strict proportionality approach, if it was looking at everything, this wouldn't be feasible. I'm not suggesting it's a credible option at all, but if you had a strict proportional approach looking at everything, i.e. cabinet, mayoralty and all the committee chairs and vice chairs, then actually yes, that would be fair, but it's not. So therefore that drives me to looking at a cascade approach, and that also removes any sort of arguments, because with the proportional approach it's not clear whether it's chairs or vice chairs we're talking about, or indeed what committees. So the cascade approach would be the most simplest of approaches, and I see what the Democratic Services Manager has put forward a proposal which is just like an illustration, but actually I think that's not very far from what we ought to have. And if with your permission, Chairman, if I'm able to share my screen, I've got 4. I'd like to, well, firstly, I would like to propose the Cascade Approach for discussion amongst members, and then also to suggest what I would tweak with the proposal from the Democratic Services Manager. So, Chairman, can you see what I've put up on the screen? You're muted, Chairman, I think. Chairman, was that? Yes, I couldn't hear you. Sorry.
Yes, I can. I can. I'm hoping everyone else can.
Okay, I believe Ms Matthews is going to be able to make this viewable for anybody watching on the public screen as or the webcast as well. So what I'm proposing here is that you'll see it's very similar to what we have in the committee papers, and I took the view that if you had a group of 18 out of 36 councillors that was not in administration, you would therefore clearly have a group or a coalition potentially who were running the council on 18 seats. So you would actually have two groups of 18 effectively, and the Democratic Services Manager would put in that scenario that you would probably have all the committee chairs going to that group of 18 who were not forming the administration, i.e. not in cabinet and presumably not having the mayoralty as well. But of course, it's worth remembering this is what would go to the largest opposition group. So therefore, for example, where it's got all those C's next to 18 on the screen, you would of course have all VCs, vice chairs, for the group that was in control, even though it's not working with a majority. So that's the scenario for a hung council on 18, or presumably in the 18 seats of the opposition. But when we get into the territory of where there is a majority group forming the administration, which is clearly 19 seats or more, you would then move, because I would work backwards from there, and therefore you would see that 3 committee chairs would go to the largest opposition group if they had 15, 16 or 17 seats. And I'm very purposely suggesting that the chair of governance should always stay with the group that has a majority, because there are clearly issues that administration would want with their agenda to get through the governance committee and would want to have the chairmanship of that. So therefore, what I would propose is that the chairmanships of both licensing and governance would go to the controlling group if the main opposition group was 15 seats or more. And you can see that there's 3 chairs, OSC, audit and planning, that would go to the largest opposition group. Moving down, and oh, by the way, red is where I've changed from the proposal that is in the committee papers. Moving down on 12 seats or more, 12, 13 or 14 for the opposition, you would see that they would have the chairs of OSC and audit and the 3 vice chairs of the other 3 committees, meaning that the majority group would have 3 chairmanships, governance, planning and licensing, and 2 vice chairmanships of OSC and audit. And I think it's also worth making a point that if there is an opposition group that is a third of the council at 12 seats, it would mean that every committee would have a chair and vice chair from different parties. And I think that's quite a good message to send out when we're looking to work together on our committees. But lower than that, on 9 seats, you can see it would just be the chair of OSC and 3 vice chairs. So you'd have, in licensing's case, the vice chair and the chair going to the controlling group. And then on 6, you have exactly the same as what's in the committee papers. And then finally, what I've suggested is I like to work in threes. 36 members is a very good number. Rather than having just 2, I would suggest that if it's a group of 3 or more, the largest opposition group, that both the vice chairs of OSC and audit would go to that group. And they're the 2 committees that do warrant opposition involvement. And even though in that scenario you'd have one very, very large group, and we were there at one time in the early 90s, so hopefully not to be repeated again. But in that scenario, you would still have opposition involvement at the chairmanship level, i.e. vice chair of audit and OSC. I know we currently have a provision in our constitution that the chair or vice chair should go to the opposition, but I would suggest we just remove that in this scenario if members supported this. And just as another point in the way that this is allocated, if you were to say back of a point system that a chairmanship was 2 points and the vice chairmanship was 1 point, you offer 18 seats, you would have 10 points because it's 5 times 2, and then it works down proportionately to that. So, for example, you can see that on 9 seats, you've got 1 chairmanship, 3 vice chairmanships. That's 2, 1, 1 and 1, making 5, i.e. half of what is 18. So what I would like to pose is the cascade approach and the what I've displayed on the screen, which is actually very similar to what the Democratic Services Manager came up with as an illustration, but with those changes which I've talked to. So I will leave it there, Chairman, and I'm very interested to hear what members have to say. Thank you. Do you want me to take this down now?
Yes, please, because we won't be able to see other speakers. If you,
yeah, has it gone?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, I've got Councillor McCarthy next.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought Peter might have got in before me there. I think he might have been waiting before me. Yeah, I like the scheme actually. I think Chris came up with a brilliant idea there, because we've looked at it as a strict proportional approach, a mathematical formula for generating these, but that still left a lot of ambiguity. And this cascade approach removes a lot of that ambiguity. And I think with that, these administration would be a benefit, and also it's fair. You know, I think it works for me. And to be really honest, I prefer a poorer fixed cascade approach than the strict proportional approach. But I don't see anything wrong with Duncan's proposal, and I'd be supporting it, and I'm hoping everyone else does. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Lamb.
Thank you. We haven't got a set group position on this, to be frank, but from the conversations which we have had, in general, there seems to be an acknowledgement that we need to have some way of moving beyond the current arrangement in terms of seats, something that's a bit more equitable. It does seem to be a point of dispute every year. And if you've got something written into the rules, much as we did with OSC a few years back, then it's pretty hard for people to argue against. It's already been set out there. It takes away a lot of the personal side of it, where a group's offering something which is right in front of them, as opposed to arguing the abstract, which is essentially what we're doing at the moment. That being said, I think we are going to disagree over which the preferred system is. The strict proportional approach just seems cleaner to me in terms of representing the will of the electorate, and the argument which has always been made in the past is that these things should be in some way related to the level of support that each party has received in the preceding election, which Cascade Approach is, but it's not directly working in that way. Now, I accept the argument that the current proposal, as it stands, would potentially risk someone just being allocated all the vice chairs, which wouldn't be particularly fair, given that actually there are some positions where it would be beneficial to have opposition people probably in those roles, particularly things like audit, where it may well help to encourage a more detailed level of scrutiny of some of these things where a member of the opposition. So I would advocate for a strict proportion approach, but one where you would look at the proportion of chairs and divvy up the proportion of chairs in that proportion, and then you would look at the proportion of vice chairs and divvy up the percentage of vice chairs in that proportion. You couldn't simply allocate all of one or the other. That wouldn't be fair. And particularly in terms of the lower numbers, that would probably actually give groups more of an input, the large succession group more of an input than is currently the case under the proposed fixed cascade approach. But I think essentially with the fixed cascade approach, we're getting ourselves tied up in knots with one position or another, regardless of who the best candidate may well be, in terms of parties not being possible because it hasn't fallen within that remit. Whereas the strict proportion approach is the one which is used in Parliament for working out who should represent the committees in that system, which makes a lot of sense to me.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Lunn next.
Thank you. I'd echo a lot of what Councillor Lamb has already said. I'm quite looking forward to having some form of system in place to hopefully take away some of the antagonism that seems to have befallen the AGMs that certainly I've attended. Having said that, I also agree that I think that my personal preference is for the strict proportional approach, and along with what Councillor Lamb said, the two reasons in my mind that I probably prefer the strict proportional approach is A, we can try and sort of line up the best, you know, if we've had a long-standing planning chair and suddenly in the strict, you know, in the Cascade approach, that they can't be the chair of planning anymore, even though everybody says, oh, they're a fantastic chair of planning. You know, the strict proportional approach allows us that bit more flexibility to try and get the best chairs from the council in the best roles, obviously depending on who the parties put forward, of course. But the other reason is that the strict Cascade approach only works with, and it's slightly arrogant of us, only works in a two-party system. Now, of course, strictly proportional does allow for the possibility that we might at some point, of course, get a third party in place. You know, if they manage to get up to 3 or 4 seats, they would technically be applicable to get 1 or 2 chair or vice chairs, you know, and the system would still stand, whereas this Cascade approach would fail very quickly as soon as we got a third party. Obviously, it doesn't look likely at the moment. I think from everybody on the call, we hope we don't get any third parties, but democracy is a funny way of acting. So I think the strict proportional approach works better with that. My only caveat to the strict proportional approach is I would personally, and this is up to the committee to whether they agree with it or not, I would put in what's been suggested in section 6.6, which is to restrict that there can't be a difference between chairs and vice chairs, because obviously if it was just down entirely to the controlling group, they could just go, oh, you can have all the vice chairs because that's proportionally what you're allocated, and that would not necessarily be within the spirit of what we're trying to achieve this evening with this change. So my proposal is that there could never be more vice chairs, or the difference between the chairs and vice chairs could never be greater than 1. So if an opposition party was allocated 3 chairs and vice chairs, they'd have to have a minimum of at least 1 chair and or vice chair. They couldn't have just 3 vice chairs and no chairs, and equally they can have 3 chairs and no vice chairs. So it just makes that protection in place there. I think also, just coming back on Councillor Crow's point, and this is something we discussed at pre-meeting about why in the strict Cascade approach or the fixed Cascade approach that had been put forward in the report, the reason that governance was sort of seated before planning in priority order was, as Councillor Barrett had pointed out, the chair of planning is chairing a sort of quasi-judicial and a non-political committee. So in theory, of course, there is no, apart from the prestigiousness of chairing planning, there is no political gain to be made from chairing the planning committee, whereas, you know, we are sort of trying to balance out the political reality of the town as well. So that's why governance had moved ahead of planning in sort of the order. Having said all that, I can't speak to every change that Councillor Crow proposed, and if I was going to go with the fixed Cascade approach, I think I'd want to go through that again. Otherwise, I'm quite happy with what's proposed on the fixed Cascade, but as I say, my preference would be strict proportional with the addition of what's been put in as 6.6. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Malik next.
Thank you, Chair. We practice democracy and first past the post system as our electoral system, where 1 vote more than your opponent gets you elected as a councillor, as an MP, and you get to form the government, whether it's local or national level. There is a reason for it. If we, in fact, if we had proportional representation system as our electoral system, I would have been agreeing with this suggestion. But the system that we practice, it gives the public the power to give and one political party the mandate. We are different political parties with different manifestos, different policies, and different approaches. That's why we have elections, where the public gets the opportunity to decide whom they want to govern and which policies do they favor. So I completely am confused that this suggestion has come up in an electoral or a democratic system. I mean, I feel that any agreement like this would be denying the public's mandate given to one particular party. So I think whoever gets, whichever, it could be Conservatives, it could be Labour, whoever gets the majority's support, they should have the right, because when you give the chairmanship to the other party, the casting votes would go with that as well. So it could at times be difficult for the governing party to go ahead with their policies. So I am completely against this suggestion, and I would prefer the normal system that we have in a democratic British democracy, which is majority, whoever has the majority decides, and they tend to keep the chairmanship so that they can have that casting vote, which would help them in pursuing their agenda or in applying their agenda. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Councillor Malik. Can I just comment on that I think you need to make the distinction between policy and review, because actually many of our committees, and I'm thinking particularly the Overview and Scrutiny Commission and the Audit Committee, don't make policy, they don't make decisions. They are actually there to review policies and to review and scrutinise and make comments, rather than to actually make decisions. And actually that is why it's considered good practice, as referred to in the report, that those committees are often chaired by an opposition member, because they're not about getting the majority group's policies or programme through. They're about actually tweaking decisions, making recommendations, trying to make things better by consensual and cross-party work. So I would take a different view on that. Councillor Lanza.
Thank you, Chair. Just responding to a few comments. I mean, I think Councillor Lunnan suggested that the strict proportional approach was more flexible in the context of there perhaps being more than two groups, but it's not worded like that. I think both propose. I mean, it just refers to the opposition group in the report. So, in a sense, it's similar to the fixed cascade approach, in that both approaches assume and allocate across two political groups, which I suppose reflects recent political reality at Crawley Borough Council. And Councillor Malik's comments are kind of interesting on the electoral system. We all know, both a national and a local level, that first past the post can produce anomalous results. So you can have a majority of the popular vote, but lose the election overall. You can have fewer seats than the party which got a minority of the popular vote. It's happened nationally. It happens locally. And as you said, Chair, when we look at two of the committees in the fixed cascade approach, overview and scrutiny and audit, they both have a scrutiny role. And I think one of the other speakers referred to the planning committee and said, well, it's non-political anyway, and that's true. It's quasi-judicial, as is licensing. So that having an opposition party have the chair or vice chair of planning and licensing in certain scenarios does not compromise the ability of the administration to make policy, because both of them are predominantly concerned with quasi-judicial issues, and a lot of planning policy is, or an economic policy as well, as goes through cabinet. So I think what we're discussing here, whichever approach is chosen, has a benefit, because we know that the absence of having some kind of formula in place does add to the rancour at annual council, which should be a largely ceremonial occasion. If we were to adopt the strict proportional approach, there's some variation in there. There's choices to be made about chairs or vice chairs. And I suppose a less generous administration could make sure that the opposition just had all the vice chairs rather than the chairs. The strict proportional approach avoids that and minimises the scope for rancour, and most certainly shortens the time frame of the annual council. There can be no doubt about that. And so it's the approach that, on balance, I would favour. And make the additional point as well that once you start getting an opposition group into double figures, so you've got the scenarios of 12 members and above, 15 members and above, and 18 members, it follows that you've got a wider talent pool within that opposition group. And the fixed cascade approach enables the council to use the broadest range of talents while not taking over the council, because at all times the the controlling group maintains control of the cabinet and all policy setting. So I think this is this fixed cascade approach is the fairest way forward, doesn't compromise a political administration that's forming cabinet. And I think as well that what we're discussing here, if you look at the other paper, is quite groundbreaking, because we don't really see any evidence of anyone else doing this. So I think from an insular perspective, looking at local government, not perhaps advertising it, this is something that perhaps other councils could be encouraged to adopt in principle, and they might well take it up. I think it does make much better use of the talents of the full range of people that people vote for. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Jones next.
Thank you, Chairman. I've listened to the debate with great interest. I have to say, I think I'm inclined to agree with conclusions that Councillor Lamb came to earlier on. But I have listened with a great deal of interest to the passionate and heartfelt calls for a cascade system for chairs and vice chairs of the various committees of this council. I very much look forward, Chair, to the same principles and the same proposals being put forward by the aforementioned councillors at the West Sussex County Council, where, frankly, if the belief in these principles is as genuine as been said, no doubt they will be put forward at the county council as well, and why not? No doubt Councillor Crowe is going to come in to argue rather tiresomely about numbers, but you know, I might be more impressed by the arguments put forward for the cascade system if I thought there was any genuine wish to do that in other areas. And what Councillor Lanza said, well, absolutely, yes, maybe other councillors should implement it if you think this is the right approach. And I urge Councillor Lanza, as a member of the Governance Committee at West Sussex County Council, to practice what he preaches. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Crowe next. You're on mute, Councillor Crowe.
My apologies. It's not like me to get that wrong. I think I might have done that twice now. That is very unusual. I did listen with great interest to Councillor Jones, who argued against the cascade approach. So if he's in favour of any approach, it would presumably be the strict proportional approach. But he referenced the county council. I have an interest as a member of the county council. But you know, very recently he was arguing against proportionality, when that proportionality meant that he was removed from the Fire and Rescue Scrutiny Committee. And of course, at the county council, the chairman of the RAC, the audit committee, is always an opposition member, regardless of how small that opposition is. And at times it has been very, very small indeed. So, you know, a chairmanship is given to the opposition at the county council, regardless. We've heard a lot about the cascade approach. I'd just like to talk a little bit about the strict proportional approach. And actually, just if I may, I would also just like to sort of give a demonstration on the screen as to what that would mean. So, is that showing, Chairman?
It's showing. Yes, it is now.
Right. Okay. So, and obviously, for everyone's benefit, this is something that I have mocked up, and it's not come from officers. Just with that caveat, but looking, and obviously members can compare this to what is either what I proposed earlier or what is in their committee papers. But under a strict proportionate approach, if we had two groups of 18, but one of those groups was in effective control of the council by having the mayoralty, you would have to recognise that administration group of 18 would have 6 or 7 cabinet members, a mayor and deputy mayor presumably, and also they would have 2 or 3 chairmanships plus either 2 or 3 vice chairmanships. So it starts coming down to fairness, and this would look very unfair to that group of 18 in this scenario who were not forming the administration. And likewise, if we go down to 9 members of the council, if you had an opposition group of 9, a strict proportionate approach. And by the way, what I've marked up is proportionate in chairs and vice chairs, not with them combined. You would see that, for example, you would have just the chair of the OSC and the vice chair of audit coming from that group who are a quarter of the council, and absolutely nothing else. So you'd have governance, planning and licensing with both the controlling group, sorry, with both the chairs and vice chairs going to the controlling group. So you can see in the bigger scheme of things, when you start throwing in the cabinet and the mayoralty, how unfair such a position would look. But these are, I've used the same numbers here. Obviously, under a strict proportionate approach, you would change every single number, whereas the Cascade approach only changes in bands of 3. But I've used bands of 3 for this demonstration, just so that members of the committee can see roughly what that would look like with these numbers that are also shown in the Cascade approach. And it's worth recognising that in any scenario where there is a group with a majority, so say i.e. with 19 seats, that there would always be at least one committee where both the chair and vice chair would come from the controlling group. So if the opposition was 17 members, which it has been quite recently, you would see that they would have the chair of audit and OSC and just 2, not 3 vice chairs, and that would be on 15, 16, or indeed 17 seats. You'd actually have to get to a hung council of 18 all for the opposition to be recognised in either the chairmanship or the vice chairmanship of any committee. So I've put this up to demonstrate how, in the bigger scheme of things, this will look unfair. And just finally, I was interested to hear Councillor Malik's comments that he talks about democracy and proportionality, but of course you could apply that to the cabinet. And that is my point, that with the cabinet and the mayoralty not included in proportionality, it therefore creates actually the first outcome if we do it just for the committee chairs and vice chairs. So I'll leave it there, Chairman, but hopefully that demonstration has been helpful for members of the committee.
Yes, thank you very much, Councillor Crowe. I think that's very clear. Did I see Councillor Lanza indicating again?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. If I could come back, just to respond to Councillor Jones's comments, I think when questioning what other people would do, you've got to look at what they actually did when they had the power. And when I led Crawley Borough Council, and when we had a Labour group of 16 in 2006-07, even without a system in place, and at this time I had the power to do something about it, even without a system in place, the opposition had the chair and vice chair of the Overview and Scrutiny Commission, they had the chair of the Planning Committee, they had the vice chair of the Licensing Committee, they had the deputy mayor, they had the chair of the Permanent Performance Monitoring Scrutiny Panel, and over the period of our administration they chaired a good number of scrutiny panels as well. So where I've had the power to do something about it, I've been quite generous. They don't call me Generous Bob for nothing.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's a very good illustration. Now I'm looking to see who's indicating next. I wonder, Councillor Crowe, could you take that down now, because
I thought I had, Chairman. Is it still showing?
It is still showing, and therefore it's not that clear for me to.
I do apologise. Is it gone now?
It has. Yes, you've come back on the screen now. So,
okay.
Are there any other members who want to come in? I can't see anyone. Right. So Councillor Crowe has made a proposal. And I'll just check that has been seconded. Can I just ask somebody to confirm they did second that? That was Councillor Lanza.
I'm happy to second it, though I noticed Councillor McCarthy's screen came on.
Okay, so all committee members have had the opportunity to speak, so we can now move to a vote on Councillor Crowe's proposal. And can I ask again, Councillor Crowe, just to clarify and outline that proposal before we vote?
Okay, thank you very much, Chairman. Yes, I'm formally proposing a fixed cascade approach with the positions allocated as per what I showed earlier and as I emailed to Ms Matthews. Do you need me to talk to it again as to what goes where? Or
I think it might be useful if you share it again, if that's possible.
Well, probably, but just bear with me a moment, Chairman, if you would. Do you know what? I think it's going to take me a minute or two to find it because I didn't think I was going to be showing it again.
Okay.
So, excuse me for interrupting. I can share it if that would help.
Okay, Chris Pedlow is going to share it, and then I'll if you just want to talk to it briefly.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Yes, so formally proposing fixed cascade approach with, as you can see, with largest opposition group of 18 seats would have all 5 committee chairs. Of course, this is just the opposition group, so obviously it follows therefore that the controlling group would have, or the administration group with 18 would have all the vice chairs, and so on and so forth, moving down from 15, 12, 9, 6, and then 3 seats with those positions as laid out. It's just worth remembering, of course, this is a recommendation to full council, and of course, members could potentially seek to change this if they wish to before at the full council. And certainly, you know, my door is open to any colleague who wishes to talk to me about getting a scheme that hopefully has everyone buy-in from everyone. Do you need me to say any more, Chairman, or is that covered?
No, I think that covers it.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now vote on the proposals that have just been moved by Councillor Crowe and seconded by Councillor Lanza. Would the Democratic Services Manager please conduct the recorded vote?
Thank you, Chair. As you've just stated, the committee is voting on the proposal which has been moved by Councillor Crowe in terms of a clear cascade approach. So, Councillor Barrett, please announce your vote.
For the proposal.
Councillor Crowe.
For.
Councillor Eade.
Is my mic on?
Your camera. Let's try again.
4.
Thank you. That was a 4. Councillor Michael Jones.
Against.
Councillor Peter Lamb.
Against.
Councillor Bob Lanza.
4.
Councillor Tim Lunnan.
Against.
Councillor Malik.
Strongly against.
Councillor McCarthy.
Strongly for fairness. Thank you.
And finally, Councillor Mullins.
Against.
Chair, we have a tied vote of 5 for, 5 against. So it comes to you as using your casting vote.
Well, in that case, I have to give my casting vote in favour of the proposal.
Councillor, with that, the amendment or the proposal by Councillor Crowe is carried and carried to full council to be voted upon, or to be ratified, I should say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So that is a recommendation to full council that we follow the fixed cascade approach with the details outlined in Councillor Crowe's proposal. That then takes us on to item 7 on the agenda, polling arrangements for May 2021. Can I ask Andrew Oakley, Electoral Services Manager, to please present the report to the committee?
Thank you, Chair. So since the last committee meeting, preparations for the May elections have been intensifying. They've really revolved around 3 things. Firstly, the complexity of having a 3-way combination with the postponed Police and Crime Commissioner election, the 3rd borough election from May 2020 combined with West Sussex County Council election in May 2021. So that's a complex combination that we've not seen before in Crawley. We've been focusing on the resilience of the core administration of the election, so the core team, and ensuring that the administration of the election will be able to continue should there be the unexpected unavailability of any of the team members. So we've been focusing on those key issues. In addition to polling arrangements and polling stations, the report which the committee has in front of you now, the Police and Crime Commissioner returning officer for Sussex has issued a set of standards for running polling stations in a COVID-safe way for May, and we've been reviewing how our existing arrangements would standards, and that's really been a key part of the review that we've undertaken. So in order to administer these elections, we're going to need to have sufficient staff to control polling and entrance to polling stations. We're going to need to have sufficient quantities of PPE, so we've been placing arrangements for procuring what is a substantial number amount of PPE in terms of face masks and visors and other polling equipment. And we're also arranging for the cleansing of the stations that's going to be necessary. And with all of those issues, we've taken a look at what is the existing polling scheme, also taking into account the staffing, which we're undergoing at the moment with a recruitment campaign. We need to recruit to around about 350 different jobs to run the whole election. And having done a survey of staff towards the end of last year, we found that we would have a shortfall of experienced presiding officers. So taking that into account, the need for cleansing into account, we've taken a look at the polling scheme with the thought that we really want to try to keep the arrangements as unchanged as possible, but accepting the fact that we might need to do some combinations of polling stations in order to ensure that we've got sufficient experienced staff across the borough. Now, having looked at that, and given the fact that we've got a lot of good venues with our community centres, it means that we're not recommending any large quantity changes to the buildings that we're using for polling stations. But in the case of schools, we are recommending that because of the cleaning requirements that we'd need to have and the uncertainty over whether schools would be required to close, and the potential therefore that they could be closing for a day before for cleaning, polling, and the day after for a further deep clean, that we avoid using 3 schools and replace them with the community centres as set out in the report. So the recommendations that are in the report would lead to a reduction in buildings from 27 to 23, but we are only recommending that, Chair, for a temporary purpose, simply to help us get through the COVID situation. Thank you, Chair.
I do apologise. I've made that mistake as well. Could I now ask? Could I thank Andrew Oakley for his presentation, and could I ask the Chief Executive, as the Council's returning officer, if there's anything she would like to add?
Thank you, Chair. I echo the points that are made by Andrew that are covered in the report. I think the key thing is, as the returning officer, it's an independent, it's a separate appointment. As the Council's returning officer, I take personal responsibility for the elections and how the elections are conducted. You can see my responses to those proposals within the report. I think it's absolutely right that we bring these concerns to members' attention. This is a year like no other compared to similar to last year, but I think the key thing is, if the elections go ahead, which we believe they are going ahead on the 6th of May, that we need to make sure that they are COVID safe for the voters, but also for the staff, the 350 or so staff that Andrew referred to. So I guess this responsibility rests on my shoulders. I think it's only right you understand the risks, that there might be some last minute contingency that we have to sort of try and prepare for. Andrew has already referred to a number of staff that have told us that they will not be participating in the elections. Like many of the people in our communities, they are still very concerned about COVID. And I think this other variant has kind of probably frightened a few more people that have dropped off our list more recently. And it's a very real issue, obviously, for people who are running in public polling stations. Obviously, with the PPE and all the safety arrangements we've put in place and the restriction of people in those polling stations to make sure that they are safe. But there's a really key point that Andrew referred to about presiding officers. Presiding officers, you don't just find them, you have to train them, they have to know about election law and if you're able to undertake your vote or not. And we know that there will be, because we are already aware, there will be a reduction in the number of presiding officers that we'll have. So the proposals in front of you reflect the fact we are trying to create some contingency and some resilience as a staff group and as the returning officer to actually run the elections. In addition to that, you can see within the report in section 5.8 about the use of schools. I think that if schools are going to ask us to close for 3 days with the disruption that schools have faced, significant disruptions, actually children and parents have faced over the pandemic, asking schools to close for 3 days and for parents to find childcare, I don't think is a reasonable ask at all, actually. So I think the proposals kind of in front of you in the report are realistic and reasonable ones that we can still continue to run the polls on in those other locations. So I'll leave it there, but I think it is really about trying to explain some of the risks associated with the election this year. And we will obviously do our very best to make sure that they are safe for voters and safe for the people that will be running them. But we need to bring it to your attention and hopefully you'll support the recommendations in the report.
Thank you very much. What I'm going to propose is that there are a number of recommendations in the report relating to temporary polling places. Firstly, those in 5.7, which relate to issues with the buildings, and then in 5.9, which relate to the use of schools. I think it's going to be very difficult if we're jumping around all over the place, you know, talking one speaker perhaps talking about Broadfield, another speaker talking about Pound Hill, then going back to Broadfield, etc. So what I propose to do is actually have a discussion on each of these, each chunk as we come to it. So what I would like to do then is, if we can go to 5.7, the first section relates to polling stations in Broadfield neighbourhood, and that is not using the Broadfield Scouts Hut, which is polling station for polling place for the two small polling districts in the north, one of which is Bewbush and North Broadfield Ward, one of which is Gossip's Green and North East Broadfield. And secondly, not using Creasy's Drive Adventure Playground in Broadfield Ward and moving polling for all of those to Broadfield Community Centre. Can I ask members who wish to speak on that particular section of the report to indicate now? We'll have that discussion and then we'll move on to the next one. I'll bring Councillor Lamb in first because he's been indicating for a long time. Then I've got Councillor Lamb.
Thanks, Chair. To be honest, my comments I think really apply generically in the round, which is earlier today I had reason to look at some of the numbers around this, and it's really quite alarming in terms of not just these proposals, but actually with existing polling stations that are not being closed, how on earth we're actually going to manage to deal with the turnout this year. The first example I looked at was Furnace Green, which obviously is not having any proposals made to modifying it, and of course does have a higher turnout than most places. But if you look at the total electorate there of 20,080 people who turned out to vote at the last set of local elections, admittedly some of those will have been on postal, and if you look at the amount of time those ballot boxes will be available for people to put their vote in, which is from 7 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night, dividing one by the other gives us a total of 26 seconds per voter for that voter to get in, bearing in mind we're only allowed to allow one voter in at a time, vote, exit, have the area clean, and then have the next voter admitted. So I'm not sure with the existing number of polling stations how it's going to be possible for us to deal with the total number of box voters. Looking at Broadfield in specific, and I'm afraid I don't have an exact number of box voters there, but based on what was cast in terms of the figures we know from sampling, how many were in each box, and then dividing those by 2 in the LEB polling districts and by 3 in the other polling districts, you get roughly 2,655 box voters who would be voting at the Broadfield Barton Community Centre in the event that we were shifting purely to that polling station, which gives an even lower time of 20 seconds per elector to get in, vote, and then cast a vote. Now, all of that assumes that we're allocating time slots to voters and they'll turn up to them, and there won't be any natural variation in terms of peaks and troughs and turnout. I'll be quite frank, I cannot see how we can come even close to normal turnout with the requirements that we are required to enforce at this election. The only solution, as far as I'm concerned, were twofold. First of which is get as many people as possible onto postals, but even then, back in the envelope calculation, even if you got 80% onto postals, you would still be struggling to deal with the turnout with the limited amount of resources or limited amount of time we have. And secondly, to try and get as many polling stations as possible. But other than that, I really can't see how we're going to have a turnout that's not, you know, absolute record low below anything we saw for the Police and Crime Commissioner election in 2012.
Well, thank you. Before I go to anyone else, I think we just need to have a caveat with regard to Broadfield Community Centre, that my understanding is that each polling station for each polling district would be in a separate room. So you would actually have 4 different rooms at Broadfield Community Centre. But I think before I bring Tim Lunnan in, I think Andrew probably ought to answer that point.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, that would be the intention. And obviously we've got a lot of work to do trying to maximise the flow through polling stations. Councillor Lamb has pointed out how long it could take to get people through polling stations with outside queuing, which is what we're going to need to have. It is a one in, one out situation. However, the number of people that we can have in any one room at one time is still to be established. So there's quite a lot of work to do on the flow. It'll be a one-way system for each venue, ideally where there's a way in and a way out and they're separate. That should ease the flow, I think. And as far as cleansing goes, we won't be looking at cleansing every single piece of equipment after each voter. We'll have a number of booths and they will be used in rotation and cleansed periodically, a period that has yet to be decided. So we will be working on the flow of voters through the polling station and trying to ease what is potentially a difficult situation.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Lunnan next.
Thank you. I mean, I think my overriding point, and this isn't aimed at the council at all, is it still seems to me a bit silly, if I'm honest, that we're looking at holding these elections in early May when, you know, I don't think the vaccinations will have been widespread enough to really get COVID under control. And I think COVID will still be a significant risk in early May. Now, I don't particularly want to see these elections deferred again unnecessarily, but I frankly think it is necessary. But obviously, as a council, that's not down to us, unfortunately. So we just have to get on and prepare, assuming that we are going to be asked to do those elections in early May. And I understand the chief executive has, you know, asked those questions of senior government ministers, or has seen those questions asked and heard the answer that they are still intending to go ahead with early May. So I just want it sort of recorded that, frankly, I think it's a silly decision to have elections in early May, but as a council, we've got to prepare for it as we are. I'm going to specifically talk about Broadfield, as I am a Broadfield member, and there's a number of different concerns I have. My first concern is the principle of us. We only introduced the new polling stations at the Scout Hut and Creasy's Drive because there was significant queuing at the Broadfield Community Centre in previous years. So the whole point of these additional polling stations was to reduce queuing and to encourage voting. Since we introduced, and you know, introducing new polling stations initially obviously has a detrimental effect on voting, because people try and go to their usual place, find out it's not open, and then go, well, I won't bother then. We've since had 2 general elections, and obviously general elections are the big turnout elections. We seem to get, you know, we get a lot more people turning up for those elections. So the people have now got used to voting in those 2 different locations in Broadfield. I should say, obviously, I'm only a councillor for the voters that vote at Creasy's Drive or the community centre, but sort of I was there for when we also put the Scout Hut in, so I sort of feel I can speak with some knowledge about that. So my concern is that we're talking about temporary changes. So for 1 year, people have to vote back at the community centre, then the next year they'll have to vote in a different place again. That obviously is, you know, it doesn't help with turnout if people are being repeatedly told to go to different destinations and they're not checking, they turn up and they go to the wrong place. And I know Councillor Quinn, who's a county councillor, still has people turning up to the community centre and saying, oh, I'm voting here, when they should be going to Creasy's Drive or the Scout Hut. My second concern is the specific reasons given for why Broadfield, and this is in the paper, why those 2 locations are apparently unsuitable. The first is for the Scout Hut, is the worry about an unmade surface, but I have seen in plenty of occasions, and I'm just thinking of where gasworks take place or waterworks, where temporary pavement solutions are put in place to allow pedestrians to access through those areas, and I think that's certainly a solution that isn't particularly costly and certainly can be achieved by the council. The second justification, which for Creasy's Drive, is that the Creasy's Drive Adventure Playground is due to close, which is perfectly true. However, I'm not sure there's any particular plans for it at the moment to be demolished or locked up with excessive force that we couldn't, as a council, regain access to it. So I'm not sure either of those reasons particularly hold as far as I'm concerned. My third concern is that, as I believe COVID will still be prevalent, focusing everybody in Broadfield who wants to vote into one location is unfortunately, you know, inherently more risky than splitting them into 3 locations. I think that increases the risk, despite obviously the efforts we'll go to try and separate the queues out. And my fourth concern is that we will have 4 different polling stations within the community centre. Presumably that means, I don't really know how this will work, but there'll be a huge amount of manning on trying to get people into the right queue initially. I don't think we've actually talked about how the practicality of it will work. Will everybody who's voting at Broadfield Centre go through one door, in which case the queue will be very slow because we'll have to wait for the right person to go to the right queue and then wait for that to be opened up? Or if we're going to have 4 queues in different locations at the community centre, then how will people know to go to the right queue? You know, is there going to be people manning them, telling them where to go? That means you have to have 4 different security people for each of those queues, as well as all the necessary staff inside. So I don't necessarily see it as a benefit or a cost reduction to have everybody going into the community centre. So those 4 reasons, sort of the I'll go through them quickly again. I don't agree with the reasons given on the paper. I think there's an enhanced COVID risk. I think that actually having people use Broadfield Community Centre and the fact that it'll change people's voting locations again in a short time, are the reasons I would strongly be against the closure of the Scout Huts in Creases Drive, and I'd propose that we don't do those. And of course, I'm just speaking as a Broadfield member, so I wouldn't have any particular comment about Grattan's Indoors Bowls Club, but I would happily listen to what local members say about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got Andrew Oakley next.
Thank you, Chair. With regard to the justification for the Broadfield proposals, the Scout Hut, it is the unmade up surface outside the Scout Hut, which we could put measures in place to deal with that. As far as Creases Drive is concerned, really we're going to need to make the change for Creases Drive, and now seemed a good time to do that. But the overall point is really that we need to do some amalgamation of polling places, albeit in a rather limited form, but we do need to do some amalgamation to take care of what we think will be a shortage of experienced presiding officers, and the ability to have those polling stations at one location gives us the flexibility to deal with some of those staff shortages.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got Councillor Crowe next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I too, like Councillor Lamb, wish to speak in generic terms, and I also, well, first of all, actually, this is not I don't envy the officers here in the job that they're having to do. This is a very, very difficult job in challenging circumstances, and I think they really are doing the best that they can here. I too have concerns about holding elections early in May, and actually, although I don't want to get into too much of a debate about it, I would like to formally propose that the Governance Committee ask the Chief Executive to write to the government on our behalf, recommending that the elections are held later, without specifying when that later would be, or later this year, without specifying. And if there was a Labour seconder for that proposal, then I will put it forward. But if there isn't a Labour seconder, then I will remove it, because I do believe that something as major as seeking to delay elections should be on a cross-party basis, rather than just simply one party calling for it. And moving on to the actual discussion itself, I take the view that the officers have looked at this very, very carefully indeed, and this is what they feel is the best that they can come up with. And unless I hear any compelling evidence otherwise, I'm minded to support the officer proposal. I do particularly share Councillor Lamb's concerns about Furness Green, which, whilst it's not actually sort of referenced as a change in the report, it is indeed, it just have the most people going through it out of any polling station in local elections. It has the highest turnout, and it serves the entire ward, albeit a two-member ward. You know, the queue could well be going, I don't know, past the pub and to the parade, I suspect, from the community centre at certain times of the day. And I'm not sure that people would be very keen to vote if the weather was bad and there was such a queue. So I don't know what we could potentially do about that, and whether we could potentially even look at maybe seeing if Crawley New Life Church would be available as an additional polling station. But the problem with that, I recognise, is that it therefore create extra demands on staff, which of course we're struggling for in the first place, and also it's a venue that we haven't used before and therefore not known to us. So I won't propose that unless Andrew Oakley thinks that that's a good idea. But I do definitely have concerns. So my proposal is well, on all of them, my view is that we shouldn't deviate from what is proposed here, recognising these are very, very challenging circumstances, unless somebody makes a very compelling case which officers actually think would agree with just have some merit. And there's a proposal on the table, if there's a seconder chairman for the end, if for the committee to take a view from the Governance Committee that to write to the government that the elections should be held later this year.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Jones next.
Thank you, I am very sympathetic to the situation in Broadfield. So if there are any alternative proposals, you know, I'm prepared to hear that later in the meeting. I have to say, I have fought elections around many different areas, not just Crawley, and you know, I have to say my experience is that we are lucky in this borough to have one of the best elections departments I've ever had the experience of dealing with, and I mean that just in the sheer quality of what they do. I mean it in the way that they approach what they do. And while I don't want to embarrass any of the election staff, I mean this when I genuinely think that what they've put forward to us is a fair representation of, and I think on the whole we should really go with that. And I really feel as well that our election staff have been placed in an almost impossible position because of all the practical problems that it really have come to light in terms of all of this. And it is my view that, much like with the reopening of the schools after the Christmas holidays, at some point all the manifest reasons why it is almost impossible to do this will, it will collapse on the government. The logical, the sheer weight of that logic is going to collapse on the government, and there's going to have to be something done. Now, I personally don't intend to second Councillor Crow's motion, because I think it, in all honesty, I think it should be someone more senior than myself on the council. But I do genuinely think that on the whole, although I do see Broadfield as a particular case in point where we might want to think about it, but the rest of the proposals, I do think we need to support. It should the elections actually go ahead. Now, that's with the exception. I'll say the exception. Even though I've indicated that possibly we need to think about it on one level, I know we're probably coming on to this as a separate subject, Chair. I do not consider the principle of what's happening with the schools the same as what's happening with the other polling stations, and so I will reserve my comments on the school till we get to that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Is there anybody else who wants to make any comment on the proposals regarding Broadfield specifically? I'm not going to take a vote at this stage. I'm going to come back. But if anybody else on Broadfield before we move on to the next area, Councillor Mullins.
Yeah, thank you. I was just looking at it and perusing it. I mean, what we're doing with Broadfield is putting 3 into the same area, 3 into 1 if you want, and that in itself might be a problem, whereas you could have probably left one of them at Broadfield Scout Hut. I do accept Broadfield, you can't use Creases Drive Adventure Playground, that's just a no-go now. So that one would need to move, and you could either have moved that in with Bewbush and Broadfield Ward, or the other way round. I don't suppose it matters which way you do it, but you could have left one and then put 2 together, which would be a little bit of a compromise and go some way to just making sure there was no congestion problems and help the flow. The only question I would accept in that is whether you can staff it that way. I know you indicated staffing, but these have got to be staffed anyway in 3 groups within Broadfield Community Centre, as you indicated. So you would just move on part of the staff back to the Broadfield Scout Hut, and then you could run 1 section there and 2 sections at the Broadfield Community Centre. I really don't see why that couldn't be done, and that would, in my view, solve the problem.
Well, thank you, Chris. I think the issue is about the presiding officers, because we have a shortage of senior presiding officers, and you could have 1 at Broadfield Community Centre for the whole building. I've got Councillor Lunnan next.
Sorry, didn't unmute myself. I mean, just two final comments are, A, we're talking about this being, we're going to have to do something about Creasy's Drive, but also the point is in the first bit of this report, it says these are temporary arrangements. So that's a bit of a, you know, is it temporary or is it not? And then B, I would highlight that there were smaller polling stations that haven't been closed, that could be closed if we're worried about presiding officers. And surely the logic would be to try and minimise the mass amount of people in one location from a COVID point of view. So in which case, close the smaller polling stations and these two polling stations. I mean, just to pick an example, there are some in Three Bridges and elsewhere that are smaller than this the polling stations we're proposing to close from an electorate point of view. That'll be my final point, and I think you'll know how I'll vote on this.
Okay, thank you. I'll bring Andrew back if he wants to make any comment at this stage.
Thank you, Chair. I think that the main point really is about the staffing that I'd make. Some of the other polling stations we've looked at, Three Bridges is an example, but each of those venues in Three Bridges is a very small venue, which would be much harder to deal with a larger electorate. The benefit of the Broadfield Community Centre, of course, is that it is very large, and there is outside space to have a number of separate queues, although I accept that's not an ideal situation, but on balance, we think it's best.
Okay, thank you. If there's no more comments from members on Broadfield, if we can then move on to the next section further down 5.7, which is in my own ward, Pound Hill North and Forge Wood, the suggestion of moving polling from the Grattan's Indoor Bowls Club to Milton Mount Community Centre for reasons which are outlined there. I have to say that as a local member, I was concerned when there was discussion about doing this before. It had to be done for the general election because the Bowls Club was unavailable. And given the circumstances, I would accept the reasoning for doing it this time round as a temporary measure. I do have concerns because Milton Mount Community Centre is a much less central location, particularly for those who live on the west side of the polling district. And I also have concerns about the parking there. But we did do it for the general election when there was no alternative, and it appears there's no alternative now. So I'm happy to go along with it, the ward member, but on the proviso that it's not a precursor to doing it on a permanent basis. I did see Councillor Mccarthy, my fellow ward member, indicating as well. Kevin.
Sorry about that. I managed to turn the volume up so I could hear you properly, and managed to switch the laptop onto standby. So I'll come back into the meeting. Well, my concerns really were not using Grattan's the Bowls Club and using Milton Mount Community Centre, really for the reasons we gave last time this was suggested, which was last year, and just accessibility and the fact that it's toward the edge of the ward, whereas the Bowls Club is a little bit more central. I'm happy enough on balance. I'll take the hit for the team. On balance, I'd support this overall, but I would just say that really I don't want this to set a precedent of acceptability for years going forward. You know, basically we're all right this year because it's exceptional circumstances, but I think in future years I would prefer it to be back at the Bowls Club.
Yeah,
I would said exactly what Richard said, but I didn't hear what he said.
Well, actually, we have said, I did say pretty much that while you were on standby. So you know, it's good that we're aligned on that. But
right, cheers,
I think that's just both ward members laying down a marker there that we accept it under difficult circumstances, but we wouldn't want to make it permanent. Is there anybody else who wants to make a comment on that section? No. In that case, if we move over to section 5.9, and this is the use of schools, and again, I will take these in turn. The first one relates to the Mill Primary School, which is currently the polling station for 2 small polling districts in Ifield Ward, one of which is in Langley Green and Ifield East Division, and one of which is in Bewbush and Ifield West Division. And the suggestion here is not to use the Mill School on this occasion, but to for each of those 2 polling districts to vote at the nearest polling station for the same division that they're in, if you see what I mean, one of which being Ifield Community Centre and one being Ifield West Community Centre. Councillor Lamb.
Thank you. But just for the avoidance of doubt, my position is entirely consistent across all of the polling stations. It's hard for me to see how turnout can be dealt with. We are losing polling stations. In terms of the schools, I do wonder if the alternative is to try and get some external provision, try and do a marquee like we've done elsewhere, with success, particularly as those sorts of facilities are going to be better ventilated. And I do wonder if there'll be the possibility then of actually having more people going through them rather than within a building. If we can be creative, of course, there are weather limitations around that, but I very much am opposed to losing polling stations overall, just because I think this is going to be an incredibly low turnout election anyway. And I really can't see how we're going to address that.
Thank you. Councillor Jones.
I intend to just again, my position is very consistent on schools, whichever one it is. So I'll only speak on this one, but you can take it that the comment applies to the others, and that is that as has been set out in the report, it is unacceptable to me, entirely unacceptable for any reason, that we are talking about 3 days of deep cleaning for schools beforehand, 3 days afterwards. Let's hope that our local children are back in schools by this point. And given all the disruptions they've had, I just cannot countenance, even for a moment, that we would be looking to disrupt them even more. And I know some of the head teachers in schools affected would be unhappy with that as well. So you know, I do think that we need to we need to accept the fact that schools are not in the equation this time. And I agree with what Councillor Lamb has said, which is let's look for alternatives. If it's a marquee, I presume the water cabin would be too you know, unventilated. But you know, I think that we have to look at other solutions, or we have to go to whatever existing provision is in those locations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Before I bring Andrew in, are there any other comments specifically on the Ifield proposals? No. Okay, Andrew, did you want to make any comment?
Well, specifically with the Ifield one, of course, we're looking to split the 2 polling districts, one to one of the Ifield community centres and one to the other, which we would hope would reduce any potential congestion.
Okay, thank you. I think it's fair to say the Mill Primary School is actually a very small polling station in terms of the numbers anyway. So actually, if you split that down into half, it shouldn't be a huge number moving to either of the others. If we can now go on to Maidenbough, where the suggestion is not to use the Brooks School and to move polling on a temporary basis again to the Maidenbough Community Centre, which is the polling district, sorry, the polling place for the other polling districts in the ward. And I've got Councillor Lanza, who's obviously county councillor for that area.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the officers for all your work on this matter under quite difficult circumstances. And I just say for the record, I share the views expressed by several colleagues that it really doesn't feel wise to be holding these elections on the 6th of May. However, as other colleagues have also said, we need to be prepared for them. So speaking specifically about Maidenbough, the Brooks School has been the subject of several debates over the years. Obviously, the undesirability of closing a school. And in the end, we kind of concluded that there wasn't a reasonable alternative for that part of Maidenbough. I accept the limitations outlined in the report about using the kind of temporary structure that we experimented with a few years ago, but I wonder if there is a possibility worth considering if there's any other kind of temporary structure that could be used within the grounds there that might make polling there safe and viable. I have to say the Brook School in local elections, there's a bit of a reputation for that location having a low turnout, but that's not borne out by the figures on page 37, where really we've got more than 1,100 people have voted at that location in the December 2019 general election. So, yeah, I'll be guided by advice, but I just wanted to ask if there's any possibility of another approach to a temporary structure which would enable that area to be used, noting that it really is quite a trek for people, especially in the south, that part of Maidenbower, to get to the community centre. Especially, it's quite a roundabout route if you're driving in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the Brook School's been discussed many times at this committee, and come up with the conclusions. Committees come up with the conclusions that it was essential in the past. Really, we're looking at a one-off situation here, I think, and the proposal is that the Maidenbower Community Centre, being a big building, we think we can contain polling in that, and we can organise it for this one-off occasion. Yes, accepting that it is quite a journey from south of Maidenbower, but we think the substitution could work at this particular election.
Thank you. Any other member want to speak on Maidenbower at this stage? Right. Then finally, we move to the third school, which again is in my own ward, Pound Hill North and Forgewood Primary School, where it's suggested that polling be combined at Wakeham's Green Community Centre. Now, once again, I'm happy to go along with this as a temporary measure, because polling for the northern part of the ward, the rural part of the ward prior to Forgewood, and the first couple of years that Forgewood was in place, did take place at Wakeham's Green Community Centre. So a lot of people in that area were used to going there anyway. And actually, for some, if they live in the rural area, it's pretty much as broad as it's long. If they've got to drive to Forgewood, they can drive to Wakeham's Green. So I don't anticipate objections there. The people who will be affected clearly will be the residents of the new Forgewood neighbourhood. And I would prefer that not to happen. But again, rather than close the school, I think we have no alternative to do it on a one-off basis. But clearly it is a one-off basis. Of course, the primary school is only a temporary polling station anyway for a few years until the new community centre's built, and we should actually have a nice new community centre for people of Forgewood now. But unfortunately, haven't delivered on that, which is another issue that we take up elsewhere. But given the circumstances, there are no other public buildings in Forgewood, and therefore, again, I would reluctantly go along with the recommendation, but on the understanding that it is a one-off, given the current situation. I've got Councillor Lamb.
Thank you. Just to say that I formally second Councillor Crow's proposal about writing to the government. I'd also like to suggest an amendment to this. I accept people's points about the limitations this year, but if we could try and see if it's possible to have some sort of provision in place that doesn't use those facilities but is in those locations, in order to ensure that there can be ongoing provision of those polling stations rather than just closing them. I think that would be preferable. I accept there will not be time to go back to Governance Committee probably about this, but that if we could at least task electoral services to look into that and see if it's viable before going down this route.
Okay, thank you. I've got Councillor Jones next.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's just following on actually from the point that's been made, which is, you know, as I said, I don't want our schools being disrupted. But saying that, as Forgewood has been mentioned, I am concerned about that because essentially Forgewood is some distance from Wakeham's Green Community Centre, and it does concern me perhaps that admittedly when Forgewood was a lot smaller, Wakeham's Green was being used, and obviously there was less of an issue then. But Forgewood clearly has grown and it's grown since then. And it does seem to me, I do wonder if we're talking about marquees for other areas, that actually maybe a marquee for Forgewood would be appropriate, because I just feel knowing where Forgewood is situated in comparison to the rest of the borough, it was always going to be the case that it was slightly remote, and I personally have concerns if the polling arrangements are at Wakeham's Green, that might be a bit too far for some of those residents. That's just a point I wanted to make.
Yeah, well, no, thank you. I certainly, you know, I would echo those comments under normal circumstances if there was an alternative. I think it really depends which part of Forgewood you're talking about. If you're talking about the western side, where the school is located and where the community centre and neighbourhood centre will be located, then that is an issue. If you're talking about the eastern side of Falcon Road, effectively opposite the crematorium, the area behind the Heathy Farm pub, etc., they're actually almost as far from Forgewood Primary School as they are from Wakeham's Green Community Centre. So if they're going to drive to one, it probably makes relatively little difference. But I think, you know, the real answer is that we should have a community centre there, which has not been provided by the developers, despite the fact that we've reached the point in the development where it should have been. You know, again, if there was a possibility of a temporary solution, a marquee or something, then fair enough, if that can be investigated. But equally, I'm conscious that our officers have spent a great deal of time on this, trying to get the best balance, and I think we should support them on that. But if there is some, you know, a further stone to be turned, then, you know, I would certainly support that. Councillor McCarthy.
Can I come back very quickly?
Yes, yes, okay.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I am talking about the western part, I think, Chair, of Forgewood. Yeah, I just do think if we do need to spend a little bit more resource on perhaps having a temporary facility, you know, obviously because we don't have the community centre open yet, then that's maybe a recommendation from this committee for our officers to look into. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor McCarthy.
Yeah, just regarding Forgewood, a lot of Forgewood residents are taking advantage of the onto Grattan's playing field, and I think as the crow flies, it's not that far then from Grattan's playing fields up to the Milton Mount Community Centre. You know, so it is, in my opinion, for all but the most for most people, it's walking distance. That's pretty much the upshot of what I'm saying. I think it's a very pleasant walk, hopefully weather permitting, and I think having a marquee there just seems excessive for the small number of people who would happily make alternative provisions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other comments? Or Andrew, did you want to sum up in conclusion, and then we'll move to some votes on this.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, just on the thought of temporary buildings, obviously a porter cabin is particularly difficult with COVID restrictions. A marquee is, yes, it's open, but of course difficulty with weather, and bearing in mind that polling starts at 7 o'clock in the morning, finishes at 10 o'clock at night. You know, if the weather's poor, that could be quite challenging. Additionally, particularly with Maiden Bower, it's where you would put it. If it's in the school site, I suspect that there will be difficulties with keeping the school open, simply because of the throughput of people.
Okay, thank you very much then. Right, as all committee members have had the opportunity to speak, we will move on to the voting. As indicated earlier, I propose that we vote on all the proposed recommended changes in polling places, including the delegations to the returning officer, unless members want to move something or make a separate proposal on any specific polling places. So can I ask that if anyone wants to make a specific proposal with regard to any particular polling places, they indicate now, and I've got Chris Pedlow indicating that he wants to make a comment.
Thank you, Chair. Just to be clear, Councillor Lamb has moved a proposal that hasn't been yet seconded, and I'm sure Councillor Lamb will correct me if the way we've got it written down is he's proposing that at the schools that the officers look into temporary accommodations at the schools if it can be worked on, if that makes sense. That is what if it's possible to do, that a further investigation happens in temporary events at the schools. That is what we have down that Councillor Lamb has moved.
Can I, yeah, and obviously we've got Councillor Crow's move, seconded by Councillor Lamb,
yeah,
regarding on a more general point about delaying the elections. Can I just ask Peter Lamb to clarify, was he just referring to the schools, or was he referring to the others as well that are stated in paragraph 5.7?
I was stating the schools.
Schools, okay. And is there a seconder for Councillor Lamb's proposal?
I'm not seconding, Chair, and I've not indicated a second, but I wanted to ask a question on this proposal, if that was okay.
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, thank you. It's really just about process. So if Councillor Lamb's amendment was carried, what would be the mechanism? As I understand, the amendment is to ask officers to go and see if it is feasible for a temporary building at the school locations. There isn't another governance meeting that's going to work in time, as I understand it, in the diary. So it's just really I just really want to understand what we could be opening up potentially in terms of what the outcome might be.
I mean, I thought my understanding was that officers were being asked to investigate it, but that if they found that it wasn't feasible, then we would stick to what the recommendations in the report are. But I don't know. I've got Councillor Jones indicating now.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm happy to second Councillor Lamb's proposal. Maybe Councillor Lamb would like to clarify this, but my feeling is that within that proposal that we look to say a marquee or an alternative within the school, or near the school, I should say, is that if there is an alternative location that is nearby the school and not within the grounds, then that is also looked at. I don't know, maybe that's not what Councillor Lamb wants, but it'd be good if you could clarify. Okay.
Councillor Lamb.
I mean, yes, ultimately I'm saying that it's left to the returning officer and members of electoral services to take the final decision on this, but as it's not something that appears to have been actually looked at those locations yet, I think it's worth at least asking that it be looked into in order to ensure that those people aren't disenfranchised needlessly. And yes, it wouldn't necessarily have to be within the school grounds, but near to where those locations of where they currently are, certainly within visible distance, so that people have the ability to vote at the location which they're used to.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Just from a practical perspective, if that proposal, we would there might have to be a budget amendment, because there isn't a budget. a budget in place for those sort of temporary venues in the current budget, and there is extra money in the budget for the election. But when that's calculated within the current budget, which is going to cabinet and going on to full council, there is not the provision. Obviously, I'm working with Andrew on the elections as well. There is no budget for that sort of expenditure, because it would be probably between £10,000 and £15,000 to do these sort of things. From when we looked into it before, but I just thought I should flag that as part of the.
Right, we're getting into other issues now. I've got Councillor Jones and Councillor Crowe.
Yes, I think what Chris Pedlow said is noted, but presumably we have a reserve, like a budget, contingency sort of budget management reserve. If there is, I mean, the sums that Chris Pedlow mentioned, they're not, they're not such significant sums that if we needed to, if it was required, we couldn't pay for out that, surely.
Right. I've got Councillor Crowe next.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm just looking at this. It looks to me like if we're talking just about schools, as I understand it, we're talking about 3 of the locations, or
that's right.
Yeah, so it's 3 out of the it's Broadfield, and then okay. My concern is while we just talked about budget, what we haven't talked about is the impact on staffing and the ability to find staff, given that we heard at the beginning of this item how the Chief Executive and the Electoral Registration Officer have struggled to find staff during the pandemic to man polling stations. And we could be potentially opening ourselves up to, if they found it did work in terms of the practicalities, that may well work, but then we might not have actually the staff to do it. So I'd welcome a view on that. And I mentioned Furness Green earlier, and if you look at the table on page 37, you'll see that for the local elections, other than Broadfield Community Centre, which has a higher estimated turnout, but of course that covers a bigger area, but crucially it's a much bigger building and therefore able to accommodate more people. The reason why I didn't suggest looking at an extra polling station for Furness Green, given that it's otherwise got the biggest footfall and yet a relatively small building, would be the impact on staff, and therefore I feel I'd be a little bit inconsistent in not pushing for an extra polling station for Furness Green, given those numbers, whilst also potentially looking at increasing the staffing demand on others, if you follow me, where actually the numbers going through those other polling stations where we'd be looking to divest the electorate off from there is already lower, and that for me feels a little bit inconsistent. So if I could just hear an officer view as to the potential impacts on staffing these additional polling stations if these investigations found that actually we could do some sort of outdoor building.
Yeah, I mean, before I bring Andrew in, I would say I certainly take your point on that. The only comment I would make, of course, is that an additional polling station in Furness Green or anywhere else, for that matter, would be an addition, whereas the marquees or whatever it might be replacing the schools would not be an addition. It would be to replace something that's normally there in a normal year. But I do take the point on that.
Would you mind if I just come back on that very quickly?
Yes,
Thank you. I think that the point is that obviously COVID is going to have an impact on the polling stations, and I would argue that Furness Green is going to be more impacted than other polling stations, given that it's got that, other than the community centre at Broadfield, which I mentioned is a huge building, it's got the greatest number of people coming through, and therefore I think this is more of an issue there. Also, actually, Langley Green to some degree as well. That's got the second highest number, and if we're not looking to mitigate those yet, still looking to divest and let the electorate off where there are other polling stations where there's already less estimated people to go through, that for me feels inconsistent. Get my drift.
Okay, fair enough. Andrew.
Yes, thank you, Chair. There are a couple of key points. First of all, yes, we are looking to amalgamate some of the polling stations specifically because of the shortage of experienced presiding officers that we need to run the polling stations. So it's part of an overall package. The second point is that we need to finalise arrangements within a reasonably short space of time. First of all, we need to give publicity to any changes that that we might wish to make, and secondly, we're in the position now of ordering supplies. I've already made the initial arrangements for ballot papers and postal vote packs. These sorts of supplies are something that we actually have to make provision for quite early on, so there isn't a great deal of time to make in-depth investigations.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got Councillor Lunnon next.
Yeah, I mean, just a few different very quick things. Just on Councillor Crow's suggestion that maybe we should look at Furness Green. In principle, not against that, but I think we'd have to create a whole new polling district, which does require us to go through a full, a governance process and then a full council process. So I think that's probably not workable from that perspective. On Councillor Lamb's proposal, I'd have to vote against, because I was told the reason we were effectively closing the Broadfield polling stations is because of a shortage of presiding officers. If we're going to get more presiding officers, my immediate preference would be for them to go to Broadfield, not to go anywhere else. And then just one last point on Andrew's point about ordering supplies. We are still vaguely hoping that these elections do get postponed. Can you order your supplies for the areas first that won't be affected either way? There's sort of lots of voters that aren't going to have a change of polling district, whether we go with this or if magically we get a postponed election. So can we not sort of order supplies in that order of go through the places first that we know aren't going to change, so they're not at risk, and then keep the ones that might change till the end in case we do or don't change at the last minute? And that's it. Thank you.
Andrew.
So most of the sorts of supplies, the ballot papers and so on, are ordered in bulk in one lot. There are smaller sundries type supplies that you can order separately, but of course we're getting a bulk discount, so we tend to place all the orders all in one go.
Okay, thank you. Right. Well, I'm not seeing anybody else indicating. What I think I'm going to do is take Councillor Crow's proposal first because that's a general proposal regarding the elections and the principle of holding them now, postponing them. So can I ask the Democratic Services Manager that was proposed by Councillor Crow, seconded by Councillor Lamb. Can I ask the Democratic Services Manager to take a vote on that?
Thank you, Chair. As you've just clarified, this is the vote on the proposal by Councillor Crow that the Governance Committee requests that the Chief Executive writes to the government over postponing the election to a later time during the year. Councillor Burrow, please vote.
For the proposal.
Thank you. Okay. Councillor Crow.
For.
Councillor Eade. Councillor Eade, are you still on the? Oh, yes. Hi.
Yes, sorry, I kept pressing it, but it just wouldn't work. Yes, for.
Thank you. Councillor Jones.
For.
Councillor Lamb.
For.
Councillor Lanza.
For.
Councillor Lunnon.
For.
Councillor Malik.
For.
Councillor McCarthy.
For.
And finally, Councillor Mullins.
For.
Chair, that's the proposal is carried unanimously.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we need to move forward with Councillor Lamb's proposal, which I think was seconded by Councillor Jones. Can I just ask Councillor Lamb again to outline what that is?
The proposal is that Democratic Services officers and the returning officer look into the possibility of putting up marquees at the locations of those schools which are being considered for polling stations, to ensure that people are able to continue to vote at those locations, ultimately with the budget to be determined, and at their, if it proves impossible, to move ahead with the proposals as they are.
Okay, and that's seconded by Councillor Jones.
That's right, Chairman. I'm guessing that's a rhetorical question. No?
Sorry, Councillor Jones, that got a bit garbled. Could you say that again, please?
Sorry, I thought that was a rhetorical question, Chair. Yes.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. It was completely muffled, so I couldn't hear what you said.
Apologies for that.
Right. If I can ask the Democratic Services Manager to conduct the vote.
So we are voting on the proposal Councillor Lamb has just clarified, or has just made clear. So hopefully all members are clear with that. So Councillor Barrett, are you for or against?
For.
Councillor Crowe?
Against.
Councillor Eade?
Against.
Councillor Jones?
For.
Councillor Lamb?
For.
Councillor Lanza?
For.
Councillor Lunnan?
Against.
Councillor Malik?
For.
Councillor McCarthy?
For.
And finally, Councillor Mullins?
For.
Chair, the excuse me, the amendment or proposal by Councillor Lamb is carried by 7 votes to 3.
Okay. Thank you very much. So that has been carried to ask our officers to investigate the possibility of temporary arrangements at those 3 schools, rather than moving to alternative locations, but with the proviso that if that isn't possible, then we would support the existing position as in the report. In that case, if we can then move to a final vote, this, and I will take guidance if I need to, but this would be on the recommendations as amended, which would be to move to the temporary polling places as shown in paragraphs 5.7 and 5.9, subject to what's just been agreed in terms of looking at alternatives for the 3 schools. I will move the recommendations to be put forward to the full council. Please note that this moves the recommendation to the vote and does not necessarily indicate my support nor that of the Vice Chair for the recommendation itself. Can I ask the Vice Chair to please second?
Seconded.
Okay. Thank you. And then could I ask the Democratic Services Manager to carry out the vote?
Councillor Barrett, please can you vote on the recommendations as amended, as you've just described?
For.
Councillor Crowe?
For.
Councillor Eade?
For.
Councillor Jones? Sorry, Councillor Jones?
For.
Thank you. Councillor Lamb?
Against.
Oh, really?
Councillor Lanza?
For.
Councillor Lunnan?
Against.
Councillor Malik?
Against.
Councillor McCarthy.
4.
Excuse me. And Councillor Mullins.
Against.
Chair, that's carried.
Sorry, can I know, sorry, I meant against. If I can correct that immediately, that would be appreciated.
I'm not sure that can be done, Chairman.
Well, I'll take
I'm sure
advice.
this has been discussed before, Chairman, and if it's rectified as soon as possible, then usually it can. It's usually a bit later on. It can't be.
I will come back to Councillor Jones to be clear on what your vote is, please.
Thank you. Against.
With that being said, Chair, it is 5-all, so we'll go to the Chair's casting vote.
Well, I wasn't expecting to be placed in this position. I actually thought this recommendation would be quite straightforward, particularly given the fact that the amendment had already been carried. But you know, I feel I have to vote in favour of the officer's recommendation as amended by the amendment which was moved by Councillor Lamb earlier.
Therefore, that the recommendations as amended has carried to full council to vote on, or
Okay.
to ratify, I should say. That include, and you've also, just for clarity, say there's the Councillor Crow's and seconded by Councillor Lamb is not going to full council. That was a straight governance decision, just for clarity's sake.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, right, well, thank you to everybody for that. And can I also ask that we put on record our thanks to Andrew Oakley, to Natalie, and to all other staff who've been involved in this review for the huge amount of work that's gone on to actually try to find a way through the issues with this year's elections and which polling places to use, because I know it's taken up a huge amount of time. And unfortunately, we have created more work tonight by asking further investigations, but there were reasons for that. But I think we've also said that if those prove fruitless, then we will go with the recommendations as they stand, and that is a recommendation to full council. Thank you very much. That then brings us on to item 8, supplemental agenda. There is no supplemental agenda. Therefore, with the business of the committee concluded, the meeting is now closed at 9:41 p.m, which I think is probably the latest governance committee we've had for quite a number of years. So I thank all members and officers for their attendance, and I declare the meeting closed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Good night.
Thank